Okay, hello. Welcome everyone to our webinar this afternoon on cultural sensitivity. And before I introduce our panel of experts, we've got just 1 hour today, of which the first 20 minutes our experts will brief us on their particular subjects of interest and expertise. And this will be followed by an introduction from Mélanie Chevalier, who's Creative Culture founder and CEO. And then after that, we'll have the talk from the experts for about 20 minutes. And Mélanie will then take us through a few of her ideas for improving the way we communicate across cultures. Okay, so without further ado, I'll introduce our experts in the order that they'll be speaking. And after I do this introduction, Mélanie would just say a few words. I'd like to introduce Chirs Arning. He's a semiotician and brand strategist and founder and director of Creative Semiotics Limited. He specializes in using semiotics, qualitative research and cultural insights to help international brands create more meaningful and relevant content. Chirs has also worked more specifically with the BBC on matters of BAME representation and on British TV. And then next up will be Sam. Sam's an activist. Sam has published articles for The Guardian on racial discrimination towards East Asians, in particular in the UK. Sam also uses his social media platform to focus and to promote activism against all forms of racism present in today's society. It has recently been appearing on the BBC, Sky and other news channels discussing microaggressions and hostility that's become more apparent, of course, against the East Asian community since the COVID pandemic. And then Oris Ikomi, who is a coach and facilitator, program manager at the brokerage and as an advisory board member at the University of East London. Oris will bring a wealth of over 10 years experience of providing solutions to meet complex business needs for organizations within the private, public and third sectors. And Oris helps global brands to engage and develop talents from the BAME groups. So thank you very much all, and I'll introduce you after Mélanie's just said a few words. Mélanie.
Thank you very much, Paul. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all on this panel and this webinar today for a really important conversation, one that more and more agencies and brands are turning to us for advice and support. And yes, as I said, we have a great panel today. We think this is a really important conversation that we're having, and we hope we'll be able to answer some of your questions. One little note on this, obviously the focus of today is related to the UK as a market predominantly, but obviously these are things and conversations that we're having across other markets. The mechanics are the same. However, the local considerations will vary from a country to another, of course. I'm sure our panelists will be able to answer some questions broadly, but just bear in mind that their expertise and where they're involved is for the UK market specifically. So I'll pass on back to Paul, who will introduce the speakers and they will introduce themselves actually.
Thanks very much, Mélanie. So let's get moving then. So Chirs, would you like to introduce yourself and
Yes, thanks very much, Paul. My name's Chirs Arning. I am a semiotician, brand expert, writer and creative, and as has been said, run an agency. My passion for this subject is partly gleaned from my lived experience as well as from my work. And as I've shared with the panel, I think we're living post-COVID and now George Floyd, we're living in an era where kind of more humanity seems more welcome in the corporate world. So I think this is a very timely event. Just a bit of background. I'm British born, mixed race, middle class. Some like to say mixed race, pure ego. My mum was born in the Caribbean, in the island of St. Vincent. And to cut to the chase, just to state my background, I grew up politically black, but raised culturally white, which I can explain offline if anyone wants to know what that is. Essentially, my mum lived through the civil rights movement in the US, campaigned for registered voters and was on the march on Washington. Then came to live in the UK in the 1970s to marry my dad, who was white British. My mum spent the first 30 years railing against the ills of the British Empire, while my dad spent the next 30 years railing against the fact that England never seemed to be able to beat the West Indies at cricket. So that gives you a sense of my background. I suppose my perspective on this issue has been forged by a sense of being different. I don't feel like necessarily sometimes belong. I feel very white in black environments, very black in white environments, but also I feel like I'm part of both, and that's part of my identity. So I guess what I'm saying is this isn't something that partly is of interest, but it's something I've been forced to think about from my beginning. You know, I've experienced street violence from white and black people. I've experienced racism within my white family, as well as estrangement from my Caribbean family. So this isn't a sob story, but it's just to kind of establish the background. I guess my experiences of identity aren't just forged through doing cultural insight. Way before that, getting into hip hop in the 1980s, which is a critical consciousness as a culture. Those of you that are into it will know. And since then, in terms of poetry and writing, as well as the work I do in branding and cultural identity. And I guess this gives me, the fact that I live within cultures, is it gives me a double consciousness, as has been theorized before, which is where I can see both sides to a certain extent. And I can see where the blind spots might exist. I was having a conversation with my dad today about racism. He's white. He's been called racist by my dad and my mum. You know, it's something I've lived with, and I can see this. So, you know, I think this is a really interesting time. The tragic death of George Floyd at the end of March has sparked off a humanitarian movement, which, whatever your thoughts on Black Lives Matter, there is the idea of racism existing has come into the agenda again. And it turns out it's not just institutional, it exists in actual people. I know, crazy. But I think it does actually provide a unique opportunity for us all, because I think that things actually go a lot deeper than unconscious bias. But my thing is we need to destigmatize the idea of racism being something that a lot of us suffer from, including myself. It might be uncomfortable, but I feel that's important for us to move forward. I believe it's us about closing the empathy gap between people that maybe suffer from the more egregious forms of racism and people that don't, but are actually very well-meaning. And I've had white friends, I've had conversations with people. I even did a racism quiz on Zoom. That was a surprise for my friends. But people are actually having a lot more open conversations about this. And this is what I think partly what we're doing here today. I don't want to speak for the other panelists, but I'm here because I think we can all do better. We can all learn. I can learn as well. And I feel like I can be a fair broker in this discussion. So I've been asked why this subject matters and how brands and companies should be pushing the agenda forward. Well, I think we need to leave behind the platitudes of just talking about diversity and inclusion when it comes to cultural identity. I think we need to go further. I also think we need to sort of recognize that it's about being color brave rather than color blind, which is something I heard recently. A recent poll conducted for ITV reported that whilst those who are not of color in the UK believe that the people that believe that racism had decreased in their lifetime was 5% more than those who believed it increased. It was the opposite for people of color, which shows there is a perception gap and there's an empathy gap. And I think if you work in advertising, the fact that we have an atrocity like H&M's Monkey in the Jungle, Prada, I think it's Prada Blackface, don't want to badmouth Prada if it wasn't, but another fashion label, and Kendall Jenner and Pepsi trivializing the complexity of racial injustice, the fact that those things happen show there have to be blind spots. Otherwise, we assume those are bad people in those rooms that sign that off. And I don't think we believe that. I certainly don't believe that. But I think, obviously, we need to look at our blind spots. Personally, I don't think having traces of racist thinking makes you a moral failure. If I did, I'd have to cancel half my family. I think it makes you a pretty normal person, which doesn't mean we need to normalize racism, but we need to destigmatize the idea that someone is condemned morally for suffering from something that is part of the air we breathe. And this is something, isn't just my opinion, it's becoming increasingly the discourse. So I think it's really important to get up to date with this. Why is this important for brands? Well, I think there's two things. If you think about people of color, my experience looking at the idea of insensitivity and representations, advertising, other sort of brand communication is people of color, it can come across as being out of touch and offensive. At the very least, it will dampen engagement, could cause alienation, or even lead to activism. And the brand can be seen as being dehumanizing and exclusionary, but at the very least tone deaf. And that can be something like this brand doesn't think that I'm British because of their representations, or this brand doesn't understand mixed race relationships, or whatever it might be. But for even a sizable minority of non-people of color, i.e. white people, if I can say that, it signifies you're off the pace, out of touch, and part of the problem. And an increasing number of people are recognizing that actually you don't have to be a person of color to not like racism. And there are people that are educating themselves about this stuff. So you're hit on that side too. And I would say there's nothing that kills brand cool faster than racism. So if I'm honest, we're also here because of Blackout Tuesday, which you would have seen is the effort, the hashtag that was created to recognise the horror of what happened to George Floyd and all the other deaths in police custody at the hands of police departments and all the other structural issues that brings out. Whilst it was great to see the solidarity across brands using the black and white imagery semiotically and acknowledging that racism exists, which is a huge positive, the thing I observed, which I've written for Canvas 8 in a trend piece recently, is there was a lot of virtue signaling about how apparently effortlessly racist thinking could be outlawed by the CEO in all these organizations, which not only amounts to premature virtue signaling, but also it shows delusion that racism is some monster in the woods that you can say, we won't have this in organization. And I think it shows that it's not only about saying racism is a moral failure and saying there's binary, either you're racist or you're not, but it's also saying that essentially the enemy doesn't live within. And I believe that we all have traces of things, the prejudices, biases that amount to the same problem. When I have people I've shown racist thinking I don't consider to be racist, go figure. Now, that's obviously not something you're going to get on Black Twitter for those that are aware of that platform. So I think for me, it's about having a bit of understanding and a bit of empathy, which I think hopefully I can bring. Although I'm not in the business of making people comfortable either. So I think it's about a balance. So I feel that for me is the next move, is the next paradigm is recognizing it's not just about systemic racism, but about dealing with racism with education. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff around the curriculum in this country about educating people as to why people like me are in this country, although I consider myself totally British. How can I help? Just segue onto that because I don't want to take up too much time. Well, I do semiotics, which is the study of culture and visual signs, focus on the cues and hidden meanings, the implicit communication within all brands, because all brands are bundles of signs and visual cues that have meaning for people. And it's kind of like seeing through the matrix, if I'm honest. That's sort of what we do, doing semiotics. And it's because it's very easy to miss what could cause offense. In terms of work I've done work on cultural identity for music label artist development. I've done work on de-radicalization, which is more of a government thing. I've worked looking at content levers with factual and entertainment content for the BBC, as well as looking at emergent codes of Black British culture, one of their music channels. More widely, I've been educating through my 60 Seconds of Semiotics video series on things like how to do diversity in advertising, mixed race identity, or more recently, racism as a semiotic problem. So, listen, I'm just going to end by saying I'm passionate about this because I'm British, but I'm also Black British and mixed race. I don't think there should be any contradiction there. Unfortunately, in some quarters, that is still seen as a contradiction, and I think there needs to be education job done. I don't want to come across as arrogant. I'm not here to preach. I'm here to learn as much as I am to impart, but that's my experience and my perspective. I'm looking forward to the Q&A later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. That's really interesting. So, yes, I'd now like to introduce Sam. Sam, would you like to talk?
Hi, so my name's Sam. I'm a freelance journalist and writer. With both Chinese and Vietnamese heritage, I'm interested in the questions of race and identity and also strongly advocate for social justice and equality. These themes are present throughout my work, in which I aim to amplify Asian voices as well as to challenge injustice against all marginalized people. I've most notably written and produced media content for The Guardian, and my articles have been cited and translated by academics and newspapers across the world. My focus most recently has been addressing the racial abuse that the British East and Southeast Asian community here in Britain has been subjected to, which has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. With this, I've spoken on Sky News, the BBC and LBC in order to try and encourage more of a conversation on the racism that British East and Southeast Asian communities in the UK face. Although my work does not solely focus on the Asian community, it's an area in which I have first-hand experience with. I really believe that having this conversation is important because I feel that the Asian voice has been kind of neglected in the discourse on racism, and I'm proud to have been able to be part of the push in having more East and Southeast Asian voices in the British media, which has often been rendered invisible. But this work has also given me the opportunity to speak on and raise awareness around issues faced by other communities of colour. I believe that it's important to be intersectional when talking about minoritized group and to look at the particular issues faced by all communities, as we cannot speak about eradicating racial discrimination for one group and not another. This leads me to the label of Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, which I will refer to as BAME because it's slightly better than the lazy BAME, as it at least emphasizes the B and the A rather than a lazy catch-all syllable. The acronym BAME first gained currency in the 1980s and is rooted in the idea of political blackness that united various ethnic minorities in order to fight racial discrimination and injustice. This term, which is used to describe ethnic minorities, has been necessary in some contexts, but has been limiting in others. The term is widely used in the work and education sectors as an umbrella term to refer to ethnic minorities as a whole group. Within this context in public discourse, this acronym is generally employed in order to acknowledge the work that needs to be done to promote diversity and to encourage the inclusion of ethnic minorities in the workforce and education systems. However, the all-encompassing BAME has its limitations. As F. Hirsch puts eloquently, the concept of BAME creates the impression that as long as the minority box can be ticked, the job of improving diversity is done. The problem with the term is that it doesn't allow for nuance. For example, in general, Black students of African origin academically outperform Black students of Caribbean descent, yet BAME doesn't allow for these nuances and prefers to box these two differentiating experiences in the B of BAME. Furthermore, BAME doesn't allow for distinction and instead groups together the experiences of Chinese students who in general academically outperform their peers. So both these distinct groups with distinct experiences in education fall under the label BAME. Furthermore, the specific issue of 50% of Black males being unemployed will not be fixed with BAME schemes who hire East Asians. A few years back, City University conducted a survey and found that the British journalism industry is 94% white. However, BAME schemes again would not help Black people who represent only 0.2% of the journalism industry if the scheme was only hiring other ethnic minorities. So the unfairness and ambiguity of the term then becomes clear when specific issues for specific ethnic groups are not addressed and are lost under the label of BAME. So it's important that we do not let the real needed action of diversifying our industries be trivialized by BAME schemes or performative activism. In order to really address the issues at hand, it's important that we do not lump all minorities under a single label and see us as a monolithic mass who all have the same degree of discrimination and oppression. In order to have real change and to have content being relevant and inclusive, that must be understood first. For me personally, when starting out working in the journalism industry, I remember working at a reputable news organization and having the menial task of organizing the calendar for the Instagram page. I was tasked with adding important dates on the calendar so that they could make posts dedicated to important days of the year. And I remember quickly having the realization that many important cultural events for ethnic minorities were missing, including Windrush Day, International Day for Abolition of Slavery, Chinese New Year, Ramadan, and Diwali. It made me realize that even the smallest role in an industry could change so much for people to feel represented. These important dates could have been easily overlooked if a white person was to have organized that calendar that day. And this goes to show why it's important that the internal structures of an organization must change and how it's important to have voices from all communities within. This would enable a company to engage with its audience more authentically and with a greater awareness to these important cultural events and sensitivities. It's important to know your audience and know your marketing. An insightful recent example is the recent controversy with the movie Black is King, directed by Beyonce and released on Disney+. Disney+ released a statement saying that it wanted to be a more progressive and inclusive company and was excited to embark on this project with Beyonce, which aimed to be a love letter to Africa and Africans. However, Disney+ is still not available across the continent. So there were many questions raised about how Disney+ have set out to produce a film for a certain demographic, even though it was not accessible to them. In the end, Beyonce worked hard to get the film aired on cable television, which is an example of how activists have and can change and aid a company to better its message and execution. Finally, this highlights why companies need to stay one step ahead to authentically engage with different communities rather than performatively responding to controversies. It's about committing to ongoing collaborations and investing in voices that matter on these topics to change for the better and become actively anti-racist in the company's morals and ethos, rather than having quick fixes and performative responses to jump on the bandwagon and act like they care about ethnic minorities in order to capitalize on the movement. First, we should not cluster ethnic minorities together, check the BAME box and move on, but instead foster a mentality that actively dismantles racist tropes and stereotypes and keeps these important cultural nuances and sensitivities in mind. Thank you.
Okay, Sam, thanks very much for that. And and lastly but not least, Oris, would you like to talk?
Absolutely, thank you, Paul. So my name is Oris Ikomi. I always say the easiest way to remember is Boris without the B. It's the easiest way to remember my name. So as Melanie said, I help with I help organisations to bridge that gap between them and audiences from Black and Asian minority ethnic groups. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to work with some leading global brands, including the civil service to manage projects on engaging Black and Asian talent, and also work with organizations to create, looking at how, especially understanding the cultural differences amongst Black and Asian sort of communities. To give you an example, so similar to what Chris said as well, a lot of the work I do came from a lived experience as well as professional experience. So probably thinking that I was probably from my actually probably think I was born and raised in London. However, I wasn't. I moved up to the UK when I was 17. So I'll leave you to figure out my age. And moving up to the UK, so I really struggled with, identity. So for example, I have my siblings, some of them were born in the UK and living under the same roof, but I just could not relate to some of the things that they were saying. Same mom, same dad, different experiences. Meet friends who talk about TV programs. I'm like, I don't really know what you're talking about. But because of how I sound, they assume I'm born and raised in England. So this really affected me and got me to a place. I think when I was about 20, so navigating through these challenges, I made a decision that I'm going to work with organizations to bridge that gap, to understand Black people, understand Black marriage of groups, because we think differently, behave differently, because I always use that there are many shades of Black, so for example, in my case, like I said, I have brothers and sisters, I have a Nigerian perspective, whereas they don't have that. So because of me being Black, again, one thing I found that was quite strange is that people assume that, because I'm Black, I should like certain Black things or certain Black music. And I'm thinking, no, I like country music, or I like I like to go, forage berries, for example. When I told my friend, I was like, dude, you're a bit weird. What Black did you find that forages berries? Again, that just goes to show that, we cannot relate to people based on the color of the skin, because there is a human being behind all of this. I grew up in Nigeria, the whole term Black was non-existent. We just saw ourselves as Nigerians, our cultures, our tribes. But this is why, again, from my lived experience, why I'm so, sort of made that decision to pursue this as a not just a career, but actually really bridging this gap, because failure to do so has a massive impact on diverse talent who are not able to fulfill their potential because people don't understand them. And watch TV adverts, and for example, I think one that might be shared later on, that just makes young Black people feel like that's not me, feel a bit traumatized. And this is why, again, going back to why I think this is important for business in particular, to do this work, particularly to understand different cultures, is that there is a psychological traumatic impact on, especially Black and minority ethnic groups, when they watch adverts that are not reflection. Actually, they are. Chris talked about this earlier. Feeling disengaged, and there's also the financial implications as well. So imagine a company potentially have made 10% more on generating 10% more revenue from an ad, but because they haven't actually understood the cultural sensitivities, benefits of the culture, then they're actually missing out on that income generation. There's the financial cost as well for brands, as well as the impact that it has on people from these communities. So again, this is why I think this work is important, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A later on, and also learning more from the day as well. So that's a bit about myself.
Thank you very much, Oris. That's great. I am quickly taking over for literally a couple minutes, because I think it is important that you have all more time to ask questions and for the experts to answer all of your questions. So whilst I show you these couple of slides, please do start sharing your questions directly on the chat and we'll pick up at those. I wanted to start my few slides. So the idea here is to bring the business perspective back and trying to understand, you know, how, when can we help? How can the experts help, sorry. And I thought I would start with an example. So I'm sure many of you have seen this. It was a campaign that was launched by the government last year in August to help combat knife crime, which has been an issue around the country for quite a few years. Their target audience was 10 to 21 years old from all backgrounds, and they came up with the concept of #KnifeFree. It was promoted across various channels, including some chicken outlets, so over 200 across the country. And obviously, this is a campaign that did backfire. And I think the comment at the bottom of the screen really says it all, really. Despite the good intentions, obviously this was not received very well and did not resonate across the various communities, and particularly the Black communities. And in fact, Mr. Uchi from Word on the Curb, which is a content agency driven around insights and youth, had a really good response to this. A few weeks later, they organized an experiential campaign at Westfield in Stratford, where they asked all of the people coming into the shopping center to actually write on chicken boxes how they would have wanted to be addressed within this campaign, and give ideas in terms of how the campaign could have been rolled out. And after that, the chicken boxes were all sent to the government as a response to what had happened. So with that in mind, I think it's fair to say that, you know, despite the good intentions, if the execution is not right or well-informed, things will undeniably backfire. And it's very important to be able throughout the process to tackle the various areas and to involve, as I said, the communities and the experts to make sure that the messages are right. So how do we pave the roads in the right direction? And I think it won't come as a surprise for all three, for the marketeers that are present, that I took 3 concepts that come from marketing, but are very, very relevant in this case. I think it's all about educating, engaging, and empowering. And this applies not only to the teams internally, it's giving them the tools, of course, empowering them to know how to produce whatever messages, initiatives that they're putting together to be relevant and on point, but it's also engaging with the communities to better understand their perspective and how they want to be addressed effectively. So how can they help? So I took our 3 experts that are on the panel today and some pictures that I borrowed from them to sort of represent them. So the coach profile, which is Oris, obviously has a very critical point in educating the teams, helping them better communicate among themselves, put the initiatives and frame them in the right manner. Then there's semiotics and cultural insights, and I'm sure that during the Q&A there'll be questions related to that, and Chris can tell us a bit more how they're interlinked to this topic. But again, doing all of this sort of assessment work and understanding where are the underlying messages and how they will be perceived. And then the third type of profile represented by Sam are activists. At the end of the day, activists are doing what they're doing because they fundamentally believe that there's a way to make a difference and things should change. So they should be the right people to come and help change the way you think, the way you communicate, and the way you share those messages across all the communities. And then, of course, there are more ways that can support this effort within organizations, including samples and panels of the groups. Co-creation is already one. I think what they did at Word on the Curb was a really clever one and something that could have been done initially before it backfired. So always thinking there is advice out there. There are experts that can come and help and support, and that's why you should go and contact them. Now, the last little slide, because I want to leave everything now to the panel and to the people on our panel, is really how and when can you do it? Apologies for the letters. I just didn't want this to be too busy. They're the profiles. So C is for coach, cultural expert is C, activist A, and semiotics is S. But looking at developing some tools and frameworks to help support your teams, this is more of a light touch approach, but there are tools that could be reused. Looking at co-creating them with the teams, understanding what your challenges or your client's challenges are, and bringing on board a coach and a cultural expert to really inform this and build some guidelines, what we call inclusivity compass in this case, to really support your teams, whatever their department and their role in the organization. Another aspect in here is more in depth, again, of educating and supporting your teams, is to provide them with the right level of training, again, bespoke, understanding what your challenges are, what you're trying to achieve, to give them really this cultural sensitivity and the intelligence that they require. And then another aspect that is very much tied into Marcomms and advertising specifically is really going through those sensitivity checks and making sure that you culturally proof your messages through semiotics and cultural insights specifically. Including activists, as I said, at this part of the process, I think is also something that could be quite relevant and bring a lot of value to the organization. So that's it for me. I will stop sharing and pass it back on to Paul.
Right, thanks very much, Mélanie, and thanks everybody for that really interesting series of talks and conversations, and we're pretty much on time, so that's great. Whilst the questions are sort of coming in, and I'm just reading one here, one from Natasha, and I'm going to ask Oris, maybe you could answer this. So the question is, what's your advice for companies on speaking out at the moment so they don't seem tone deaf or virtual signaling, but they aren't also silent on other issues? And if anybody else wants to answer this as well, just to let me know.
Yes, so that's a good question. Something that the work within, especially recently back on Black Lives Matter, we've also identified with organizations where they feel the need, feel like they should say something, but at the same time thinking, well, not really comfortable what to say. I suppose with this, it's about, first of all, it's about companies really taking a step back and really questioning their motives behind why do we want to say something, and really have that sort of self-reflection and awareness to say, okay, why are we saying this? What is the purpose of what's the purpose behind it? And because I think, especially in the day and age that we live in, it's very easy to feel pressure to do something or to speak out. So I suppose it's having that courage to actually do what is right, even though it might not be, be going in the same direction as everyone else. So I suppose the point is about, just really taking a step back to think about motives, why, and see how it fits into, again, to your organization. If it's not really why this is so important, if it's not aligned to your organization's sort of mission, if it's not authentic, if it's not real, it does come across as well when people read it. So this is why it's so important to really take that step to really think about it properly and to make sure that it's authentic. And actually, sometimes it's better off to scan internally first of all to see, are we actually living what it is that we're about to put out there. And if it's not true to what's happening internally, so it might be better off to just maybe not post something, or actually just say, this is just really share something authentic. So, this is where we're at currently. We may find, it's challenging for us to actually comment on this matter because we don't really have much experiences. However, because of what's happening, we feel we should say something we are learning, just something that's more real and authentic. So that, again, as human beings, we're very intelligent now to know whether someone is actually being real or not real. So that's the approach I would say, say, because I don't know if anyone else would like to add to that.
Anyone else, Chris or Sam?
I completely agree with what Oris says. I think there is that, it's a struggle with companies nowadays, and a lot of people have come out to support Black Lives Matter, but when we look at how the staff are treated, how Black staff are treated, they're often still the people who are underpaid, who don't have the same opportunities as other people. So it's all and well wanting to pronounce to the world that you support Black Lives Matter, but if Black lives don't matter in your company, then that there's a real problem there. An example of this is the group Lady Antebellum in the US, and they changed their name to Lady A in order to remove themselves from an era of a pretty dark era in American history. But in doing so, there was another singer who went by the name Lady A, and now they're in a lawsuit. But yeah, basically that singer was a Black woman, and she's now being forced out of her name, because this group who have said that they, you know, support Black lives and want to remove themselves from the dark history of the US, have then gone on to harm a Black singer and remove her of her name. So it's very interesting how, you know, this plays out and how intentions play out.
Okay, thanks very much.
Can I speak to that, Paul, as well?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, great question. Yeah, I agree with what the guys have said. It's just my contribution would be, there's two issues with this. One is inauthenticity on the basis of not being in tune with the brand purpose. I mean, I think an example of a brand that has, I mean, it was troubling in a way to see their advertising, because it seemed to speak for a very radical position. And that's, I probably can tell the brand I'm going to talk about was Ben & Jerry's. But they talk about, you know, basically dismantling white supremacy. I mean, that's as far, you know, maybe there is a brand that's gone further, but they were extremely strident in their view. Now, the thing with Ben & Jerry's is that they did give a historical context for why they said this, but also what they have in their advantage is they have pursued consistently a cultural strategy in their branding brands campaigns over the years, which is they're pretty unashamedly Democrat and liberal, being from Vermont, which I believe is the Bernie Sanders state. They've never hid their political affiliations. They've gone up against the Doughboy, which I think was kind of an implicitly binary position in terms of political affiliations with that organization. They've branded ice creams Cherry Garcia, Ido around gay marriage, and more recently Pecan protest. So, I mean, they've got a track record. They tick the boxes in that and more. And I think there's a distinction needs to be made between something that comes out of brand purpose and something that is an opportunistic play around cause marketing, which someone latches into a current in society, and they feel, as Sam was saying, they can basically boost their cultural capital by interpolating themselves in a debate. And that can be through, first of all, that can often commodify blackness, which is another issue we haven't talked about, which I think Oris touched upon, certain ways of being Black. And that in celebrating apparently celebrating Blackness, brands can also fall into the trap of conveying certain views of Black cool, of Black swagger. And what's really damaging about this actually contributes to this idea of Black invulnerability, Black toughness. And when I've spoken to people in the States who've said racist things about Black people, is this idea of Black people aren't as sensitive emotionally. I've literally had that say. These images actually reinforce this idea. So when you've got someone on the floor who's suffocating, all these images and all this stuff reinforces this delusion about Black invulnerability. But the reality is Black people are the most vulnerable people in society in so many ways. This is another example. But I also want to say that the other problem is bandwagonism. The example I've give here is that of mixed race couples in advertising in the UK. Now we've seen, I don't want to go on about mixed race girl, because that's just too easy to take that up, the kind of frizzy head, Nana Cherry lookalike. But the other thing is mixed race couples, some of whom are called out by real mixed race people because the kids don't look like they would be the kids of the couple in the ad. And that's something a lot of people obviously don't understand or appreciate with casting, whether you should maybe use an actual family to be more authentic. So there's things like that. But the point I'm making with that is when the next supermarket does that, you know it's because they're converging and they're Me Tooing rather than because they actually believe necessarily it's the right thing to do. There's other issues to do with colorism and, you know, mixed race rather than, you know, Black and all that sort of stuff I could go into. But there's a lot of traps that can be fallen into when trying to do the right thing. And as I think goes back to what Mel said in one of her slides, is that, you know, road to hell can be paved with good intentions. And I'm not someone that looks for this stuff, but it is a thing. It is a thing. Often brands do fall on their face because they don't have the right people in the room to advise them.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. We've got a question from Anna here, and it's speaking of sensitivity checks. So could the panel recommend any organisations, charities or individuals that could help with making sure that a work an agency is creating is inclusive and intersectional rather than tone deaf and tokenizing? And who'd like to pick up on that question? Anyone?
Sure. I mean, in terms of organizations that could help with making sure, I suppose the work that we do, I suppose individually could speak to that as well. And however, there are other agencies that I know, or organizations that could do that. So I mean, there's one I know that's called Inclusive Boards. They are a charity that basically helps with, again, works within, the name says it, inclusive, about just looking at languages and how you interact and engage with you know, black and I suppose black and minority communities. So yeah, that's what I would say. But I think yes, is the work that we do visually potentially speaking to that as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Oris. Another question from Neil Condron, and this is to everyone again. And thinking of specifically of brands targeting young people, so what does the panel think are particularly successful at achieving cultural sensitivity, and how and why? So Chris, you might have a view on this.
Thanks, Paul. I do. I'd just like to loop back very briefly to the previous question, which is the work I've done for the BBC is precisely doing those cultural sensitivity checks. They're looking at the levers and dampeners of, or the drivers and dampeners of engagement to content, i.e. things that are more likely to drive people to consume more of mainstream factual and entertainment content, and things like exclusionary cults, stereotyping, appropriation, misrepresentation, things that are likely to dampen engagement. So semiotics, because it looks at narratives, at casting, at settings, at the packaging of a program, and often cases actually programs that really are going to appeal and actually are very interesting and complex and well thought through with complex characterizations actually don't land because of the packaging, because of the words that are used. So it can be very subtle things that put people off. So that would be my my response to that. I mean, again, Nike would be a good example, because the Run London campaign a few years ago was very, I don't know if Oris was involved in that in some way, but see him nodding.
I was just going to mention that as well. I was going to refer to that campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen it a couple of times. I mean, it's funny because it was widely lauded in the press, but I know people of colour that have got some issues with it with regard to what we talked about just now, which is the performative blackness. I mean, this is a term, it's not the only term that I've coined, but it did for the project I referred to in terms of looking at the emerging codes of Black British culture, looked at performative blackness as a kind of mode of stereotypical blackness created for the culture industry, which is black cool, which is black swagger, which is sexy guys, sassy women. You know what I'm sort of saying? And obviously hip hop, the industry, not the inner culture, but the industry's often played and peddled these images, which I think do a lot of damage. I mean, a lot have been focused on low expectations for black boys, particularly at school, but I think it actually does wider damage to the perception of black people in this country. But I think that it's funny that even brands that connect in terms of understanding subcultures can still fall foul of not speaking for other black people who aren't into hip hop, who aren't into the things that black people are meant to like. And one thing that came out of this Black British project on Black British emerging codes was how this is a stereotype in itself, but it goes against the mainstream expectation that how geeky Black British people are, how much they're into detailed and, you know, detailed of things, and get really super detailed about everything, about, you know, arts and music and reference points. And, you know, this in hip hop, you'll know about the beat diggers, people that can quote you when something was made. And these are things that aren't necessarily portrayed in mainstream culture, as well as the vulnerability in the black community, the mental health issues. It's not to say that every ad promoting cool, wanting to promote cool, should be foregrounding those issues, but there's definitely an issue with how mainstream Black British culture is portrayed in advertising still, even after all these years. But I mean, I think that there are ways in which some brands can get aspects of it right. Nike sometimes got it right.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Question for you, Sam. I think that everybody's talked to this, but I think you made a point about it as well. And it was around how one can target various communities in the most relevant manner, because often fame is characterized as one single topic, but the reality is that there's a lot of diversity within this segment, which defeats its purpose in the first place. So how does one go about it?
Yeah, I think it's a hard question, because it's, you know, there are so many communities, and I know that I get that it's hard for a company to try and target everyone. At the same time, I think the issue is when a company tries to target different demographics and think that the job is done by kind of giving a blanket, let's say, advertisement that doesn't really mean anything, and then it then makes the messaging unclear, it makes the company's morals unclear, and then it just kind of causes a lot of controversy. So I think the way to combat that really is to really just have people of color in those positions in order to make the messaging clear. You know, for example, I'll go back to Disney, because they have done quite a lot of movies nowadays where they're actually trying to get people of different, so for example, Mulan, they've hired actual Chinese people, and, you know, even using actual Chinese instruments in the soundtrack, for example, when before they wouldn't have done that. So it's just, you know, it's attention to detail that really makes a difference, I think.
Can I add to that as well?
Yeah.
Paul? I think in addition to that as well, because in some cases you may not have someone from that background within the team. I also, in a session like that, I think supporting that organisation, agencies really, I suppose, educate themselves. I think if you understand a culture, that could be from you could actually go travel there to live there for a year, a week, or a day, wherever it is, actually just go and see what it's like there. I think that those lessons from that experience in itself are so valuable, so that when you design adverts, you know, whether you might not have someone from a Black or Asian background within your team, but at least doing that in itself can make a huge difference. Actually, just really understanding. Then it really helps actually form your thinking process when creating adverts, when creating content, to know that, oh, because I'm aware of this, about this culture, so actually I know that this would be potentially be offensive or be appreciated, for example. So that's another thing I'll add to that. So education. I think learning and development departments could actually play a key role in that as well within organizations to educate teams, to actually create content and training programs on how to educate teams to actually understand different cultures and different. In essence, we're talking about culture, really, truly. So yeah, to really understand that.
Okay, great, thanks. I've got a question from Clara, and it's an open question to whoever would like to answer this one. So, what advice can the panel give for creative development research? Should there be some sort of quota to ensure minority representation, or would you recommend separate research to ensure cultural understanding in more depth?
I'll take a stab at that first, if that's okay. That's something I'm really passionate about. So quotas. Again, I appreciate that businesses, in essence, are there to make profit, and that business need, that drive could sometimes influence decisions, also the pace of decisions as well. So with that, again, it goes back to, why are we doing this? You know, what do we want to position ourselves? I think this also provides an opportunity for business actually potentially a strategic positioning to position themselves. Actually, because Mike have actually started doing this as well, where now they're so bold in being involved in political campaigns, and like Colin Kaepernick, for example, with the kneeling down, taking the knee in the US. So I suppose with this is, I mean, I get the need for quotas, but I think personally I'd question if companies are focused on quotas, that, are they really understanding what it is that they're getting into, or they just, where they're operating from. I think, so in addition to what I said about learning and development departments, I think also the research department also needs to play a key role in really taking the time to study and understand and educate themselves, and then pass on those learnings through either tacit knowledge or implicit to the team to really understand before they start creating things. I think if we get this right, there'll be no need for quotas. However, there's a need for quotas. I think quotas themselves can be quite insensitive in terms of how it's perceived by people on the receiving and thinking, are you treating me as a number? But I think it's to be, I think more go down the research side rather than first before the quota as a way to achieve quick. I think quotas are quick, ways to actually quick objectives. Whereas if you want to create something that's more long-term and sustainable, definitely done the research. So that's what I would recommend.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Chris, we had a question for you, by the way.
Yeah.
How are semiotics and cultural sensitivities interlinked? We're interested in this, and can you tell us more about how semiotics and their role overall in the bigger picture? And do you have any interesting case studies to help?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess semiotics and cultural sensitivities are linked in the sense that semiotics is a look through the matrix of culture. It suggests that culture is the water through which we swim without noticing it. People are flabbergasted at how interesting British culture is. But when you do a semiotic study, as I did for BMW Mini, looking at Britishness abroad and why British people and representations of British are so alluring but so baffling, what you realise is that there's a whole class thing going on that British people would understand, but foreigners don't understand. And actually, a lot of British brands play with the contrasts and paradoxes in British identity to do with tradition and subversion of tradition. And that was how we helped BMW Mini create campaigns that avoided cliche, and it successfully conveyed a sense of premium Britishness. And that was really about understanding how culture is a web of associations, and as sign users in culture, we're all decoding this. I've done a lot of work in Japan as well, obviously a culture which is very, very different to the UK, and the use of seasonal advertising, the use of Zen and sort of codes of Buddhism, for example. You can't explain Muji and their advertising without understanding Buddhism, without understanding evanescence, without understanding transience. A lot of green tea advertising is also driven by that. So, you know, brands are parasitic on culture. Brands can't communicate to a mass. The fact that mass marketing exists is predicated on the fact that there's an intermediating thing between us as individuals and the advertising, and that is culture. Otherwise, brands would have to spend millions more communicating individually. And there's certain colors, there's certain narratives, you know, the hero narrative, certain colors, red versus blue being calmer, very, very basic things that most of us read in certain ways. And that's the principle upon which semiotics is based. With regard to, aside from the BMW Mini example, with regard to specific case studies, the work I did on respecting Sam's injunction not to say the word BAME, B-A-M-E representation, you know, the work we did on the content dampeners, which are exclusionary codes. There are two types around class. Then the British class system, there's stereotyping, appropriation, misrepresentation, and tokenism. We use those to show different gradations of alienation in advertising. And then we talked about the drivers. And the drivers were meant to work across the BAME community, which is a huge community. It comprises about 13% of the British population. About 7% of that is South Asian, about 5% is Black, African diasporic, obviously Caribbean, and obviously there's East Asian representation for my ex-girlfriend there, British Taiwanese. But, you know, how do you actually do something that represents all those people? They're so different in so many ways. So you're dealing with people that may have come from war-torn areas like Somalia, who are relatively recently acculturated in the country, all the way through to third-generation Indians, some of whom may self-identify as white, and I'm not joking here. So you've got a broad church there. This goes back to the quota system and what was Oris's point on that. It's really difficult to generalize because you've got within that community, for example, Muslim and Bangladeshi and Pakistani versus Indian, you've got very different political affiliations there, very different necessarily potentially educational attainment, just like you have between the African Black British and Caribbean Black British communities. So it's very, very difficult. Just to say, in terms of that work has sparked other work on sort of representation within mainstream programming. It's been used by the BBC in their responses to Black Lives Matter in terms of informing how they do that. So that work was, it was geared towards improving the appeal to BAME groups of factual and entertainment content, but it's since percolated through the organisation to help them think about the things they could do better in diversity in general. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah, I think it does. Thanks very much. I've got a slightly different question. I'd like to ask Sam, first of all, to have a go at this one. It's from Jivan, who thanks the speakers very much for delivering insightful talks. It says I support victims of sexual violence, and I wanted to ask about how we can make our organisation more accessible to non-white victims. And community engagement is always a great way. However, it's very little follow-through, unfortunately. Building trust is very important, especially with such a sensitive matter. And so what methods could we try?
Yeah, that's a hard question because it's not really my expertise. But I think it is the mistrust with those mainstream companies that we're seeing new companies flourish. So we're seeing, you know, Black-owned companies, and we're seeing companies that who really care about the demographics and, you know, the people they're targeting. I don't think that I am the best person to talk on this question. I'm sorry.
I am happy to. Yeah. So first of all is would I say, like, where are you currently engaging non, what's the word? I'm looking at the exact words that we use. Is it non-white or?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So non-white. So look at where you're currently engaging, and quite simply, I think is, for example, just give an example I did recently. So Charity Jobs is a platform that engages, it says that what the name says, they advertise jobs within the charity sector. And I got in touch with them to find out what the diverse, basically the percentage of the like Black and Asian minority ethnic groups within the platform. And they didn't have because they don't collect raw data, but they did a research recently to say that sort of gave them that insight based on the respondents. And I think about 7%, I believe, were from Black or Black British backgrounds, and I think quite a small percentage from like Asian or Asian British background. I think that the thing is, when you go to agencies, actually, it's important to find out what if you're going, whoever you engage or recruit from, to see what is the breakdown of the diverse candidates, for example, and or look for organisations that have a higher proportion of what do you call it, the audience that you, the non-white audience that you're looking for. Because also breaking down, actually, when you say non-white, who are you referring to? Who do you actually want to have in the organization? You know, are you talking about Black people? Or are you talking about also with Black, there's like Black African, there's Black Caribbean. So it's actually really breaking down this segmentation down. So you're clear internally as to why you want these people as well. How do they fit into your strategic objectives? So it shouldn't just be, we want to have no white people in the organization. It's more so, why are we doing this? How does this help us actually further our objectives? So that doesn't come across as a tokenism thing or a tick box exercise. I think those are steps to taking first before even going to engage. Because again, one thing I probably said that's relevant to everything we said today is that think about the long term. You may do that now. Okay, have 5 or 6, I don't know, non-white people in your organization, but but what happens when they're in there? How do you ensure that you keep them within the organization as well? So you also create a strategy to also to retain these people in the organization, and not just that. It should be, I believe that the overall objective should actually be where recruiting should not just be based on a white or non-white or whatsoever. It's actually just create a space where anyone from any background could thrive within the organization. So that, and that comes from actually looking at your policies as well, your recruitment policy, and make sure that it helps to further your objectives. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
I know we're tight on time. I just wanted to very, very quickly just say, I do think in non-white communities, there tends to be a lot of reticence for seeking help. I'm generalizing massively, but what I know of the South Asian community, the Caribbean community, and also the East Asian community as well, that kind of face the shame of taking things outside of the family and the community is pretty big. I think racial shame is something we haven't talked about generally, and that's something that a lot of people of colour suffer from. And that means that there isn't necessarily a culture of asking for help. And incidentally, the BBC drama I May Destroy You, which is a Michelle Cole drama, does deal with this. You've probably seen it, Jivan, but it's an interesting take on this whole issue of suffering sexual violence and how you seek help within non-white communities. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Yeah, we are kind of fast running out of time. I just wanted to ask everybody very quickly if there's one sort of key do and don't in this whole subject that you like to suggest, and that could be around the common traps companies and brands fall in when it comes to wording, visual identity, creative messages, and ideas. So if there's a do and one do and one don't, that would be great. So who would like to start? Fast thinking, guys.
Yeah, it's good to think about this one. I'll probably say just don't do things for the sake of it. Just to yeah, just because you feel like you have to do something. And I suppose the do would be to be mindful, and yeah, just be mindful of actually that you're dealing with human beings and not yes, we all have skin colors and so on and so forth, but we are individuals at the end of the day. So yeah, it's actually really connecting to that and learning to, I think Chris alluded to this at the beginning, we're moving into, I believe, like more of the humanistic era where it's about authenticity, it's about togetherness and collectiveness. And I think this also goes back into, I think, the British culture. And so it's, it's like, as growing up in Nigeria, it's very much of a community togetherness. We do things together. I can go knock on my neighbor's doors and actually even giving them a call to say, I'm going to be at your house at this time. So there was we didn't have those sort of like distance or barriers for it. Whereas my understanding of this one from when I moved to the UK is that, people are very like separated, for example. So the organization must be, I suppose, create their own culture. Yes, we're all somehow influenced by, whether you're British or not British, influenced by the British culture way of doing things, but it's also looking beyond that to actually create your own culture that's authentic to your organization and live from there. I think that's, in my opinion, actually helped to achieve like sustainability. So yeah.
Okay, great. Chris, do you have one do, don't?
Thanks, Oris and Paul. Yeah, I think the one thing I would say is expect some discomfort in challenging your own views. I mean, I've had to come across, my colorism and the things that I suffer from just my background and from living in a society which has perpetuates certain things. So I think one thing is be prepared to be discomforted, and that's moral bravery, that's moral courage, not just in this issue of race, but in every aspect of change, becoming a better person. I think it's not, but also let's try and destigmatize the idea of racist thinking, because most of us have it. Most of us have some form of prejudice. And I think that's the basis. We can all say that. I mean, me and my dad talk about it. We joke about it to a certain extent. It's so important. I think that has to be the starting point. And if we can actually not shame people who have grown up with certain views, like, someone that can say, look, I was more ignorant before, I want to learn, I can get better. Things would change so much if we could do that. I mean, I know it seems like a very different parallel, but, I'm not a mental health expert, but I do think sort of things like destigmatizing mental health, particularly things like suicidal thinking or whatever, that can really help people connect and actually avoid things that may be more dangerous down the road. If we can just destigmatize a little bit, and I know it's politicized, and I think the do would be, just recognize that maybe, another view through semiotics, through behavioral economics, other ways, some of the services that create culture and Mel took you through. Some of those things can be really useful in these complex and difficult challenges. We're all here to learn. That's what I'd say. I'm not preaching, but I have got perspectives, and I do passionately believe that we need to talk about racism, but destigmatize it. On the one hand, don't say it doesn't exist, but also let's not be pointing the fingers and condemning people. We all have more work to do. That's what I'd say.
Thanks, Chris. And Sam, finally.
Yeah, I think my don't is similar to Oris's. It's don't do things for the sake of doing it. Don't be performative or jump on the bandwagon. Instead, do the ongoing work. Learn, uplift others, change your workspaces. And do your best.
Fabulous, guys. Thanks. And to wrap up, maybe Melanie, you've got a word of advice for us.
Do I? No, I won't be very creative here. I think the don'ts are really around don't ignore cultural bias, because it does exist, and cultural bias is something we don't see. So we just have to be made aware of it and accept it. I don't think it's impossible, because I think at the end of the day, there are, as I said, experts and teams that are there to help you along the way. You just need to consult the right people. And in terms of the do, not really creative but really what I said before, educate, engage, and empower. I think those are really the three key things there.
Great. Well, we actually have finally overrun and run out of time. And we've had some fantastic questions and some really great responses and some very informative insights, guys. Thanks very much to the speakers and for you all for attending. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oris, Chris, and Sam.
Thanks,
My
guys.
pleasure.
Thanks for the
Well done.
invite. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.